Welcome to the Like Iron Research Review, a subsection of the Like Iron podcast where we pick an academic article and discuss it. If you enjoy nerding out about strength, fitness, and performance, this is the podcast for you. Remember, research is ever-changing, and our views and opinions will change as well. None of the information in this show should be seen as medical advice, and you should always talk to your medical provider before starting a fitness regimen. Let's get into the cast, Like Iron.
Come paint my face, come take my hand.
Welcome to the Like Iron Research Review. My name is Shannon.
I'm Wes.
And in the Like Iron Research Review, we take a look at a paper, talk about its applicability to practice, both in strength training and whatever else that interests us. Today, we have a paper titled Strength Training as Superior, Dose-Dependent, and Safe Prevention of Acute and Overuse Sports Injuries, a Systematic Review, Qualitative Analysis, and Meta-Analysis. It is authored by Jeppe Bo Lauerson. I have no idea if I pronounced that right. I'm sorry if I butchered that. Thor Anderson and Lars Bo Anderson. So I believe these guys are out of Denmark. But yeah, so it's looking at the ability of a strength training program or strength training in general to quote unquote prevent injury. So it looked at overuse injuries, acute injuries, and basically it says superior because in previous literature by these guys, previous research, they looked at kind of comparing types of interventions like stretching, strength training, proprioception and balance kind of training, and they found that strength training had the biggest effect on injury risk. So one thing we want to talk about first, which is kind of it's more semantics conversation, but Wes, what do you think about this idea of injury prevention? Can we really prevent injuries, or is there a better phrase that we can use for this?
Yeah, I think that in a study like this, where we're just looking at the relationship between strength training and injury, prevention sounds almost causative in my mind. And I think semantically a better term we could say is injury risk reduction. So you say as we increase strength training, you see a reduction in the risk of injury because you don't really know if your intervention prevented something else. You just see a relationship. So I think it's better to have like a softer, term that goes along with that.
Yeah. So from a paper like this, it's not looking at mechanisms. It's not looking at cause and effect. It's just looking at a correlation, right?
Yeah.
And so because this paper is not looking at cause and effect, we can get into the details and the results. But basically, the logic behind a strength training program, as far as reducing risk of injury, is kind of along the lines of load tolerance and increasing resilience, at least in my mind, and I think a lot of people look at it that way. If we, through strength training, increase a tissue's load tolerance, and we can kind of define load tolerance as the amount of load a tissue can take before you start experiencing symptoms or you get quote unquote injury, so acute or overuse.
Yeah, so I think just to expand on that, it's when you look at injury, usually injury occurs or some sort of tissue damage occurs once the external load or the loading, exceeds the tissue's capacity. And so like you were saying, if you can get stronger, you can make a good argument that says, okay, we're increasing the tissue's capacity to that load. And so now you're more resilient to damage or injury or whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. Essentially, we're just increasing the preparedness of an athlete rather than like fixing some mechanics or whatever else narrative you want to give. So studies like this, they look at, and this is a common statistic you'll see in injury-related and health-related research, is of the risk ratio, which is basically just the ratio of the probability of an outcome in a intervention group versus the non-intervention group. So it's you divide the intervention group or the exposed group by the unexposed, and so if you get a number less than 1, that means there is a less of a risk of an injury in this case strength training group. So in this research, there's a wide range of strength training studies, and they kind of just looked at both qualitative and quantitatively the difference between them and how it changed the relative risk ratio. And what they found was this kind of dose dependent response where more seemed to be better, but we're going to talk about the intricacies of that. Do you have anything to add about kind of the details of the study design, Wes?
I think just something to keep in mind when you're dealing with like a meta-analysis, right, is the study of studies. And so you pool together a bunch of studies, and then you have an established inclusion and exclusion criteria, which kind of whittles down all those studies into a handful of studies. And so you whittled down the amount of studies, I believe it was to 6 studies, of which, were similar enough where you could make a comparison. But like Shannon was saying, each of the studies had slightly different training interventions, including the exercises used, the volumes and intensity used. And so that's something just to keep in mind when you're dealing with a meta-analysis.
Mm-hmm. So the actual purpose of this review was to, and this is a direct quote, systematically identify and analyze qualitatively and quantitatively randomized controlled trials of strength training-based sports injury prevention programs. So they just want to compare these strength training protocols that seem to reduce risk of injury and see kind of like maybe the best manner or the variables that are associated with the reduced risk. So as they found, strength training has a very significant effect on injury risk, and there seems to be a dose-dependent response. So I guess we can just dive right into application. And for powerlifting, it's pretty straightforward because our sport is lifting, right? So our training is our sport, and our sport is our training for the most part. So it's very kind of like you can draw pretty direct associations here. But Wes, why don't you talk about how this comes into play for a non-barbell based sport or a non-strength training based sport?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you are an athlete, usually you have a lot on your plate in terms of the amount of training and the amount of stress involved. And so you have practice, you have games, you have your training. A lot of cases, if you're in college, you also have school. And so there's a lot that goes into, I guess, the amount of stress that is in your life. And I think we have, based on this paper and some other papers, we have good evidence to suggest that, strength training is going to be incredibly useful for your sport, to help you become better at your sport, but also to help, reduce the risk of injury. However, I think this is one of those things that it comes down, again, to monitoring the individual and the athlete and saying, okay, we want them to strength train. It's going to be useful, but how much should we implement? And this comes back to the idea of titrating things up slowly over time. And so I would say we want to start, with a certain dose and then see how they tolerate that dose. And then if they can handle more, slowly add more. It's one of those things I wouldn't suggest going from like 0 to 100 right away, going from no training to all the training in the world. I would say let's come up with an intelligent training program for that athlete or the individual and increase that over time based on how they respond to that dose. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's perfect. It's even though the study found that an increase in volume and intensity led to a significant decrease in injury prevention, it has to be done in a very intelligent manner. One of the studies incorporated kind of the most complete program design because it had like a technique familiarization phase. It was individualized. It had deload weeks or kind of recovery weeks within it. And so it was kind of the most complete program. Unfortunately, the study itself had some limitations, but it gave us some good things to look at when designing a strength training program that's kind of preventative in nature. So this idea of titrating things up, we can bring in the idea of kind of from previous literature, I'll bring it up real quick, is the idea of an acute to chronic workload ratio. And basically what that's saying is, you don't want kind of spikes or troughs in your workload. You want to build up over time. So it's very common sense, but basically you want a high chronic workload or high chronic training volume because you want to be accustomed to it. So the acute training load you don't want any spikes in that. So the acute would be like, say, training for a week, and then the chronic would be the rolling average of the last 4. So comparatively, We don't want giant spikes in acute. We want high chronic loads, but we want to build that up over time.
No, yeah, absolutely. I think it just goes back to the idea of, right, you're trying to increase the athlete's resilience, to some sort of, training stimulus, and say, okay, like these guys are getting their tissues are getting more resilient to the loading and becoming, I guess, less vulnerable, more resilient, and doing this so in an appropriate manner in this long-term fashion, I think is the most appropriate way about doing this.
I think that about wraps it up, actually.
Yeah, I think in summary, we can say, this meta-analysis, whittled down a bunch of studies, and we got 6 studies that they compared. Each one had some sort of strength training intervention, although slightly different. All, basically combined together, we find that there's a good relationship between being stronger and, reducing your risk for injury. And so, again, I would say, for the athletes out there, don't be afraid of the weight room. Try to get strong, do so in an intelligent manner, and try to become more resilient.
All right. This has been an episode of the Like Iron Research Review. If you have any questions, post them below. We will link this paper in below as well, and it's a great paper, so you should read it. It's going to give you a bigger picture than what we're just saying. All right. Have a good one.
See ya.
Someday you too will go to war, and by that time
Thanks for listening to this Like Iron production. You can find us on Instagram at ShannonDubs, at like.iron_Wes, and at like.iron.strong_Jackson. As always, we love to hear from our audience, so if you have a question or want to chat, drop a line in the comments or hit us up on social media. If you like what you hear, let it be known. Like and review or tell your friends. And as always, stay strong like iron.